The 8th of May, 1945. Quiet morning over Featherstone Park, Northumberland. A group of German prisoners stood in the camp yard, their hands trembling as they held papers marked with repatriation orders. They had been told the war was over, that they would finally go home. But when the British officer stepped forward to address them, something impossible happened. No celebration, no relief, just silence broken by one prisoner who stepped forward and said in broken English, "Please, sir, please don't send us back." The officer froze. He didn't understand. These men had been captive for months, some for years. Why would they want to stay? Then another prisoner spoke, then another. "We have learned things here. We cannot go back to what we were. Germany is not the place we left." That moment would shatter every assumption about loyalty, about patriotism, and about what captivity could teach men who had believed they were fighting for civilization. Because inside those northern hills, Britain had been waging a different kind of war. Not with bullets, but with education, truth, and the slow, painful gift of understanding. And what happened next would shock both the prisoners and their captors, proving that sometimes the hardest part of war isn't the fighting. It's learning to think differently. Stay till the end to see how dozens of German soldiers chose enlightenment over return, and how one camp became a place where minds, not just bodies, were set free. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to support our channel and help us tell more forgotten stories of history that deserve to be remembered. It was the first week of March, somewhere near Bremen. The sky hung low and grey. The sound of Allied artillery never stopped, a constant thunder that shook the ground. Ernst Hoffmann, a 28-year-old German officer, had been fighting for 4 years straight. The Wehrmacht unit he commanded was collapsing around him. Supplies gone, reinforcements non-existent, orders contradictory. When the British tanks finally rolled through the shattered German defensive line, he thought it meant execution. He had been taught that capture meant the end of everything. Nazi propaganda said the British would torture officers, that intelligent prisoners would be eliminated. So when he saw the khaki uniforms advancing through the smoke, his chest tightened with dread. He considered the pistol at his side, not to fight, but to finish himself before they could. The irony came fast. The British soldiers who surrounded the surrendering Germans didn't shoot or strike. They moved with practiced efficiency, calm and professional, checking for weapons, calling for medics. One lieutenant, his insignia marking him as a Cambridge-educated officer, approached Ernst and said in perfect German, "Legen Sie Ihre Waffen nieder, der Krieg ist für Sie vorbei." Lay down your arms, the war is over for you. Ernst stared at him, unable to move, not yet believing that surrender meant survival. They gathered the German officers and enlisted men separately, loading them onto different trucks. The smell of diesel and wet earth filled the air. Ernst sat among 30 other officers, all silent, all waiting for whatever came next. He watched the British soldiers work with quiet discipline, no shouting, no triumph, just men doing their duty. For the first time in years, Ernst wasn't the one giving orders. The war was happening to him now. For the first few hours, fear was louder than exhaustion. He waited for the interrogation, the beatings, the humiliation he had been promised would come. The British transported them to a temporary holding area, a commandeered school building with intact windows and swept floors. No chains, no guard dogs. Just tired men sitting on benches, drinking tea from enamel cups. "They're giving us tea," one German captain whispered. Another replied, "They're softening us for interrogation." But Ernst had seen something in the lieutenant's eyes, not hatred, not even contempt, just weariness, the same exhaustion Ernst had felt for months. That night, a British intelligence officer came through with papers and questions, name, rank, unit, nothing aggressive. When the officer noticed Ernst's university ring, Heidelberg, philosophy, he paused. "A thinking man," the officer said in German. "We need more of those." Ernst didn't know how to respond. In the Wehrmacht, thinking had become dangerous. Following orders was survival. The officer smiled faintly and moved on. Outside, trucks rumbled continuously toward the coast. The British were capturing thousands daily. By spring 1945, more than 400,000 German and Italian prisoners were held across Britain. Most expected brutal treatment. Few imagined they would be given the chance to learn. When Ernst was transported to England days later, the journey felt unreal. Grey sea, quiet harbours, a country that looked untouched by war. At the Portsmouth docks, he watched British civilians go about their lives, children playing, shops open. It didn't match what he had been told. Britain was supposed to be starving, collapsing, defeated. Instead, it looked calm, ordered, almost peaceful. During processing, each prisoner received a number, a medical check, and a brief interview. Ernst's education was noted. Officer, university degree, philosophy, the clerk wrote. Suitable for Camp 18. Ernst didn't know what that meant yet, but he saw organisation where he expected chaos. They travelled north by train, passing green hills and stone villages. Ernst pressed his face to the window, watching a country he had been taught to despise. By evening, they reached Northumberland. The landscape turned wild, rolling moors, grey sky, wind that never stopped. When the train finally halted, they saw barbed wire, guard towers, and long wooden huts stretching across a valley. Featherstone Park, Camp 18, one of the largest and most unusual POW camps in Britain. By mid-1945, it housed over 4,000 German prisoners. But unlike other camps, this one had a purpose beyond detention. It had classrooms, a library, and something Ernst would soon learn to fear more than any weapon: access to truth. The gates opened. New prisoners filed in. The first shock was the atmosphere. Not harsh or cruel, but structured. The barracks were basic but clean. The guards spoke firmly, but without malice. Ernst was assigned to an officers' section, housed separately from enlisted men, as Geneva Convention required. That first evening, a British officer addressed the new arrivals. Captain Morrison, a schoolteacher before the war, spoke in clear German. "You are here as prisoners," he said, "but you are also here as men. What you make of this time is your choice." Ernst didn't understand what he meant, not yet. On his first morning, Ernst woke to the sound of a bell. Roll call, then breakfast. Porridge, bread, weak coffee. Nothing generous, but regular. After the meal, guards announced work assignments. Some prisoners would labour on nearby farms. Others would maintain the camp. But a third group, officers with education, were directed to a different building, a long wooden structure with windows and rows of chairs facing a blackboard. Ernst's stomach tightened. This was it, the interrogation centre, where they would break them psychologically. He entered with 20 other officers, all tense, all silent. Inside, the room smelled of chalk and wood. A British major stood at the front, grey-haired, glasses perched on his nose. He looked like a professor, not a soldier. "Gentlemen," he said in German, "welcome to re-education." The word hit Ernst like a slap. Re-education. Propaganda. They would be forced to renounce Germany, to betray everything they believed. He felt rage rising in his chest, but the major continued calmly. "You have been lied to. For years. By your leaders, by your newspapers, by your teachers. Here, you will have the chance to see the truth. What you do with it is yours to decide." Then he turned and wrote on the blackboard, Geneva Convention, 1929. Article 17. Intellectual pursuits shall be encouraged. Ernst's anger faltered. They weren't being tortured. They were being taught. Over the next days, Ernst learned the structure of what the British called the re-education programme. Every morning, officers attended lectures: history, political philosophy, international law. Every afternoon, they had access to newspapers, uncensored British and American press. Every evening, discussion groups where prisoners could debate freely. It was unlike anything Ernst had experienced in years. In Germany, questioning had become treason. Here, questioning was required. The first lecture was on the Treaty of Versailles. The British officer teaching it, a historian from Oxford, presented both German and Allied perspectives. He acknowledged Germany's grievances, the harsh terms, the economic devastation. But then he showed what followed. How Hitler had used those grievances to justify aggression. How legitimate anger had been twisted into genocide. Ernst wanted to argue, to defend. But the evidence was overwhelming. Documents, testimonies, photographs, things he had never seen in German newspapers. The second lecture was harder. It was about concentration camps. Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. Names Ernst had heard, but dismissed as enemy propaganda. The lecturer didn't shout or accuse, he simply presented evidence. Survivor testimonies, liberation reports, photographs taken by Allied soldiers. The room fell silent. Some prisoners shook their heads, refusing to believe. Others sat frozen, faces pale. Ernst felt something crack inside him. He whispered, "Das kann nicht sein." That cannot be. But the photographs didn't lie. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his entire worldview collapsing. Everything he had fought for, everything he believed Germany represented, civilization, order, culture, was built on a foundation of horror. Other prisoners reacted differently. Some rejected everything outright. "British lies," they hissed. "Propaganda to make us ashamed." Others grew quiet, withdrawn, processing alone. A few, like Ernst, began asking questions. If this was true, what else had been hidden? The camp allowed them to seek answers. The library held books banned in Germany, philosophy, history, political theory. Ernst spent hours reading Kant, Locke, Mill, thinkers he'd studied before the war but never fully understood. One book shook him deeply. Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. It described exactly what had happened to Germany. How closed thinking, how the rejection of criticism, how the worship of the state had led to totalitarianism. He began attending discussion groups in the evenings. Other officers, mostly educated men like himself, gathered to debate. A British chaplain, Reverend Thomas, moderated. He never preached, just asked questions. What makes a society civilized? Can following orders excuse cruelty? What responsibility do individuals have for their nation's crimes? At first, Ernst defended Germany out of habit. But slowly, his arguments weakened. The evidence was too strong, the truth too clear. One night, he said aloud, "I think we were wrong." The room went silent. Another officer, a former teacher named Klaus, nodded. "I think so too." Others stayed quiet, but Ernst saw it in their eyes. Doubt. The first crack in the ideology they had served. The transformation wasn't instant. It was slow, painful, like healing from a wound that goes bone deep. Some prisoners never changed. They clung to Nazi beliefs, forming isolated groups within the camp, hostile and bitter. But others, maybe a quarter of the camp, began to shift. They read, they questioned, they talked. They started to see the war differently, not as Germany defending itself, but as Germany destroying itself. The British didn't force belief. They simply provided information and space to think. That, Ernst realized, was more powerful than any torture. Because you can't unlearn truth once you've seen it. By late April, Ernst had changed. Not just his opinions, but his understanding of what it meant to be German. He began writing in a journal, trying to process everything. "I thought we were the victims," he wrote. "I thought we were defending civilization. Now I see we were destroying it." Around him, other prisoners were undergoing similar transformations. They called themselves Die Erwachten, the awakened. Not proud, just descriptive. Men who had opened their eyes, but soon They would face the hardest test of all, because the war was ending and home was calling, and returning would mean confronting what Germany had become. By early May, rumours spread through Featherstone Park. The war was almost over. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Germany was surrendering. The camp erupted in confusion. Some prisoners wept. Others celebrated quietly, relieved the killing would stop. But many felt something else entirely: dread. "What are we going back to?" Klaus asked Ernst one evening. They sat outside their barracks, watching the sun set over the Northumberland hills. "Ruins," Ernst said quietly, "physical and moral." For months, prisoners had been writing letters home, receiving censored replies. Ernst's family wrote of bombings, starvation, despair. His mother's last letter mentioned that his younger brother, a Hitler youth leader, had died defending Berlin in the final days, died believing the lies Ernst now saw clearly. The guilt was crushing. On the morning of May 8, 1945, the official announcement came. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Captain Morrison gathered all prisoners in the main yard. The British flag flew at full mast. The sun broke through clouds for the first time in weeks. Morrison spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Gentlemen, the war has ended. In the coming weeks, repatriation will begin. You will return to Germany." The prisoners stood motionless. Morrison continued, "But I want you to know something. What you have learned here matters. Germany will need men who can think, who can question, who can build something better than what was destroyed. You have been given a gift. Truth. What you do with it will determine your country's future." Then he paused, looking at the faces before him. "For those who wish to continue their education, we will provide resources before you leave. Books, materials, contacts. You will not go back empty-handed." That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A group of prisoners requested to meet with Morrison privately. Ernst was among them. 37 officers, all from the re-education program, all transformed by what they had learned. Morrison received them in the administration building. They stood awkwardly, unsure how to say what they had come to say. Finally, Ernst stepped forward. He had been chosen to speak because his English was best. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking slightly, We have a request." Morrison waited. Ernst took a breath. "Please don't send us back. Not yet." Morrison's expression shifted to confusion. "You want to stay?" Another prisoner, Klaus, stepped forward. "We have learned things here, sir. Things that will make us dangerous in Germany. Not dangerous with weapons, but dangerous with ideas." A third man added, "The people who will control Germany after the war, they will not want men who question. They will see us as traitors." Ernst spoke again, choosing his words carefully. "We know we are prisoners. We know we have no right to ask. But we are frightened, sir, frightened of going back before we are ready, before Germany is ready for us." The room fell silent. Morrison looked at them, these enemy officers asking to remain captive. It was unprecedented. "What exactly are you asking?" Morrison said finally. Ernst glanced at his comrades, then back at Morrison. "Permission to stay until Germany stabilizes. Permission to continue learning. Permission to prepare ourselves to rebuild rather than simply survive." Morrison sat down heavily. "You understand what you're asking? You want to extend your own captivity?" "Yes, sir," Ernst said. "We have seen what happens when men return from war unchanged. They rebuild the same structures, the same hatreds. We want to return different." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to consult with higher command. This is unusual." He dismissed them, promising an answer within days. That evening, the camp buzzed with tension. Word spread of the request. Other prisoners were shocked, some supportive, many furious. "Traitors!" one group shouted. "You betray the fatherland!" Ernst and his companions faced hostility from fellow Germans, accusations of collaboration, of weakness. But they held firm. They had seen the truth, and they couldn't unsee it. 3 days later, Morrison called them back. His face was difficult to read. "I've spoken with command," he said, "and with the War Office. Your request is complicated." The prisoners waited, breath held. "We cannot force you to stay," Morrison continued. "Repatriation is official policy, but—" He paused. "We can offer you a choice. Those who wish may volunteer for extended education programs, work camps with vocational training, teaching positions helping other prisoners learn English, even university courses through correspondence." Ernst felt tears sting his eyes. They were being given a choice. A real choice. "How long?" Klaus asked. "Until you feel ready," Morrison said. "Weeks, months, within reason. We won't keep you indefinitely, but if you genuinely want to prepare yourselves for returning, we will help." Ernst and 36 other prisoners volunteered immediately. They signed papers, made official requests. They chose captivity over freedom because they understood that freedom without understanding was just another kind of prison. Over the following months, as most prisoners were repatriated, Ernst and his group remained. They studied English, learned trades, read philosophy and history. They prepared themselves not just to survive in post-war Germany, but to rebuild it. British officers worked with them, providing books, arranging correspondence courses, even bringing in guest lecturers. One visiting professor from Cambridge told them, "Germany needs builders, not just of cities, but of ideas. You can be those builders." The extended prisoners formed a tight community. They called themselves Die Brücke, the bridge, men who would span the gap between Germany's past and its future. By autumn, repatriation could no longer be delayed. Orders came from London. All remaining prisoners must return. Ernst and his companions prepared to leave, gathering the books they'd been given, the notebooks filled with ideas, the certificates from courses completed. On their final evening, Captain Morrison hosted a farewell gathering. Tea, biscuits, and awkward speeches. Morrison addressed them one last time. "You asked to stay because you wanted to learn," he said. "But I think you taught us something too. That people can change. That education matters. That even in war, understanding is possible." Ernst stood to respond, his English now confident. "Captain Morrison, you gave us something we did not expect. Not freedom, but truth. And truth, we have learned, is the foundation of real freedom." When he finished, the British officers and German prisoners shook hands. Not as captors and captives, but as men who had shared something rare. The transformation of minds. The journey home began on a cold October morning. Germany was unrecognizable. Destroyed cities, displaced millions, chaos everywhere. When Ernst finally reached what remained of his hometown, his mother wept to see him. "You look so different," she said. "What happened to you?" Ernst smiled sadly. "I learned to think again." In the months and years that followed, Ernst and many from his group became part of Germany's reconstruction, not as politicians or leaders, but as teachers, translators, community organizers. Men who brought back not just survival skills, but democratic ideas. They faced resistance. Many Germans weren't ready to hear criticism of the past. But slowly, patiently, Ernst and others like him planted seeds. Seeds of questioning, of responsibility, of openness. One evening, years later, Ernst visited a rebuilt school where he now taught. Above the entrance, a quote was carved: "Die Wahrheit macht euch frei." The truth will set you free. He smiled, thinking of Featherstone Park, of Morrison, of the moment he and 36 others asked to stay captive so they could become truly free. Because they had learned the hardest lesson of all, that defeat can be a teacher, that enemies can be educators, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not in winning, but in being willing to change. The transformation Ernst and his companions underwent didn't end with them. It rippled outward, touching thousands. By 1946, the re-education programs that began experimentally at camps like Featherstone Park had become official British policy. Over 400,000 German prisoners passed through Britain during and after the war. Tens of thousands participated in education programs. Not all changed, many resisted, but enough transformed to make a difference. Ernst returned to a Germany divided and broken, physically and spiritually. The country he had fought for no longer existed. In its place were occupation zones, refugee camps, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding not just buildings, but beliefs. He settled in Hamburg, where much of the city was rubble. He found work teaching English to German students, many of them orphaned or displaced by the war. At night, he volunteered with British occupation authorities, helping translate documents, mediating disputes, building bridges between victors and vanquished. The British recognised him from his time at Featherstone Park. They trusted him because he had proven himself willing to learn. Other members of Die Brücke scattered across Germany, each carrying the same mission, to help their countrymen understand what had happened and why it must never happen again. Klaus became a journalist, writing carefully about Germany's need to face its past. Another, a man named Friedrich, worked with youth groups, teaching civic responsibility. A fourth opened a bookshop specialising in banned authors, making available the works that had opened their eyes in captivity. They faced constant opposition. Many Germans wanted only to forget, to move on. "Why must we dwell on shame?" people asked angrily. But Ernst and his companions understood that forgetting guaranteed repetition. One evening in 1948, Ernst spoke at a community meeting in Hamburg. The topic was whether schools should teach about concentration camps. The room was divided, heated, angry. Ernst stood and spoke quietly. "I was an officer in the Wehrmacht," he said. "I fought for 4 years believing I was defending civilization. Then I became a prisoner in England. And there, my captors did something unexpected. They showed me the truth. They proved that what I thought was civilization was actually barbarism." The room went silent. "It hurt," Ernst continued. "To learn that everything I believed was a lie, that I had served evil while thinking I served good. But that pain was necessary, because only by facing what we did can we become what we should be." An older man in the audience stood, furious. "The British brainwashed you! You're a traitor!" Ernst met his eyes. "No," he said calmly. "The Nazis brainwashed me. The British simply gave me access to facts and let me think. There's a difference." Slowly, painfully, Germany began to change. The re-educated prisoners were part of that change. Not the only part, not even the largest part, but significant. They became teachers, civil servants, business owners. They brought back not just language skills or technical knowledge, but democratic values. The belief that authority should be questioned, that individuals have responsibility. That truth matters more than loyalty. By the 1950s, West Germany was emerging as a new nation, still scarred, still guilty, but genuinely trying to build something different. The new constitution enshrined human rights, democratic processes, and the rule of law. Ernst saw echoes of what he'd learned at Featherstone Park in these founding documents. One day in 1952, he received a letter from England. It was from Captain Morrison, now retired. "Dear Ernst," it read, "I often think of you and the others who asked to stay. I want you to know that your courage, to admit you were wrong, to want to change, gave us hope. We British can be proud of winning the war. But I'm most proud of moments like yours when we helped former enemies become free men. If you ever return to England, please visit. You'll always be welcome." Ernst wrote back immediately, thanking Morrison for the gift he'd given, not freedom from captivity, but freedom of thought. Years later, in 1965, Ernst did return to England. He travelled north to Northumberland, to where Featherstone Park had stood. The camp was gone, converted to farmland. But a small memorial plaque marked the site. Camp 18, 1944-1948, where thousands learned that peace begins with understanding. Ernst stood there for a long time, remembering the fear of capture, the shock of kindness, the pain of learning he'd been wrong, the slow transformation from soldier to thinker. A local farmer approached, curious about the foreign visitor. Ernst explained who he was, what the place had meant. The farmer nodded slowly. "Aye," he said. "My father was a guard here. He always said it was the strangest posting he ever had, teaching Jerrys instead of guarding them. But he reckoned it did more good than any battle." Ernst smiled. "Your father was right." As he walked away from the site, Ernst thought about all the prisoners who had passed through that place. The ones who resisted learning, who returned to Germany unchanged, bitter and broken. And the ones like him who had accepted the painful gift of truth. Both groups went home, but only one group was truly free. In the end, Ernst realised Britain's greatest weapon wasn't her armies or her air force. It was her belief that even enemies could be educated, that minds could be changed, that understanding was more powerful than vengeance. The men who asked, "Please don't send us back," weren't afraid of Germany. They were afraid of returning to ignorance. And by giving them the chance to learn, Britain didn't just win a war. She helped plant the seeds of a lasting peace. Because the strongest prison isn't made of wire and walls. It's made of lies and closed minds. And the deepest freedom isn't escape from captivity, it's liberation of thought. Ernst carried that freedom for the rest of his life. And in small ways, in classrooms and conversations, in articles and arguments, he passed it on, one mind at a time, one truth at a time. Building the bridge between what Germany was and what it could become. And though he had once fought to destroy Britain, in the end, Britain gave him the greatest gift a soldier can receive. A reason to stop fighting and start thinking. That was the real victory. Not the surrender signed in Berlin, but the transformation that happened in camps like Featherstone Park, where men who came as enemies left as students. Where the weapons of war gave way to the tools of peace. Where dozens of German officers shocked their captors by asking to stay imprisoned, because they understood that inside those wire fences, they had found something worth more than freedom. They had found truth.